China dumped millions of crawfish into their rivers, and nobody stopped them. Not environmentalists, not scientists. Nobody. 10 years later, the crawfish took over so completely that the entire country's economy shifted. Rice paddies became crawfish farms. Restaurants changed their menus, and a crustacean the size of your finger created a multi-billion-dollar industry that nobody saw coming. This is the story of the most successful invasive species introduction in history. And yeah, China did it on purpose. Let's get one thing straight right away. When we say crawfish, we're talking about the red swamp crayfish, Procambarus clarkii, for the science nerds out there. These things are native to the southern United States, specifically Louisiana and the Gulf Coast. They're the same crawfish you'd find at a Louisiana boil, covered in Cajun seasoning, and served by the pound. Aggressive, and they breed like there's no tomorrow. Now you're probably wondering how American crawfish ended up in China in the first place. The story goes back to the 1920s, when Japan first brought them over from the US as a food source. The Japanese were raising them in ponds, making decent money, and being relatively responsible about it. Fast forward to the 1930s, and somehow these crawfish made their way from Japan to China. Exactly how is debated. Some say Chinese traders brought them over deliberately. Others claim they escaped from Japanese facilities during World War II and hitchhiked their way across the sea. Either way, by the 1950s, crawfish were showing up in Chinese waterways. But here's where it gets interesting. For decades, the Chinese didn't really know what to do with them. Crawfish were considered pests. They dug holes in rice paddies, weakening the walls. They ate young rice plants. Farmers hated them. The government didn't care about them one way or the other. They were just there, multiplying quietly in ditches and rivers, mostly ignored. Then came the 1980s. China was opening up economically. People were getting hungrier for diverse foods. And someone, somewhere, probably in Jiangsu province, looked at a crawfish and thought, what if we ate these things? Not just occasionally, but in massive quantities. What if we turned this pest into profit? The first crawfish restaurants started appearing in Nanjing in the late 1980s. They served them spicy, covered in chili oil and garlic. With cold beer, it caught on slowly at first, then faster. By the mid-1990s, crawfish consumption was spreading across eastern China like wildfire. People couldn't get enough of them. Street vendors were selling them by the kilo. Restaurants were opening specifically to serve crawfish and nothing else. And this is when the Chinese government made a decision that would have given Western environmentalists a heart attack. Instead of trying to control the crawfish population, instead of eradicating them as invasive species, China decided to go all in. They actively encouraged crawfish farming. They released millions more into rivers and lakes. They gave farmers subsidies to convert rice paddies into crawfish ponds. The government looked at an ecological problem and said, let's make it an industry. This was around 2000 to 2005, the peak of the deliberate release period. Exact numbers are hard to come by, because China doesn't exactly publicize environmental modification projects. But we're talking about millions upon millions of crawfish released into waterways across central and eastern China. The Yangtze River Basin, the lakes of Hubei Province, the rivers of Anhui, all of them got flooded with crawfish. The scale was unprecedented. This wasn't accidental introduction. This wasn't a few crawfish escaping from a farm. This was organized, government-backed ecological engineering. And every environmental scientist watching from outside China was screaming that this was going to be a disaster. Here's why they were worried. Crawfish are what biologists call an R-selected species. That means they reproduce fast, mature quickly, and aren't picky about their environment. A female crawfish can lay 200 to 600 eggs at a time. Those babies reach reproductive maturity in just a few months. One breeding pair can turn into thousands of crawfish in a single year under the right conditions. They're also incredibly adaptable. Crawfish can survive in polluted water that would kill most fish. They can burrow into mud and wait out droughts for months. They're omnivores, eating basically anything they can get their claws on. Plants, insects, fish eggs, dead animals, garbage, doesn't matter. They'll eat it. And they're aggressive. They'll outcompete native species for food and habitat without breaking a sweat. So when China released millions of these things, the expectation from outside observers was ecological catastrophe. The crawfish would eat everything. destroy native ecosystems, cause fish populations to collapse, and generally turn Chinese waterways into crawfish-dominated wastelands. Scientists were writing papers predicting disaster. 10 years passed, and here's what actually happened. The crawfish population absolutely exploded. That part was expected. By 2015, crawfish were everywhere in central and eastern China. Every river, every lake, every irrigation ditch had crawfish in it. Population estimates were in the billions. If you stuck your hand in pretty much any body of water in Hubei province, you'd probably touch a crawfish. The colonization was total and complete. But the ecological disaster? It didn't happen. At least not in the way people expected. Sure, some native species declined, but Chinese waterways didn't collapse. The ecosystem adapted. Fish that could eat crawfish thrived. Birds that could crack open crawfish shells had a population boom. The crawfish became part of the food web instead of destroying it. Why? A few reasons. First, Chinese waterways were already pretty degraded. Decades of industrial pollution, agricultural runoff, and overfishing meant the ecosystems weren't pristine to begin with. The crawfish were moving into an already disturbed environment, not a healthy one. Second, the crawfish had predators in China. Lots of them. Fish, birds, snakes, even humans. The population was huge, but it was being controlled by predation. And third, this is the big one. China started farming crawfish so intensively that they were pulling millions of pounds out of the water every year. The crawfish weren't just reproducing. They were being harvested on an industrial scale. The human appetite for crawfish was acting as population control. Let's talk about that industry, because this is where the story gets wild. In 2005, China's crawfish industry was worth maybe a few $100 million. Small time. By 2015, it was worth over $30 billion. Billion. With a B, by 2020, it had crossed $50 billion. Today, it's closing in on $60 billion annually, generated by a crustacean that China dumped into rivers as an experiment. The center of this industry is Hubei province, specifically the area around Changjiang City. This region produces about 40% of China's crawfish. I mean, they've converted hundreds of thousands of acres of farmland into crawfish production. Rice paddies that had been growing rice for centuries were retrofitted for crawfish farming. Here's how it works. The rice crawfish system is actually pretty genius. Farmers flood their rice paddies deeper than normal. The crawfish live in the paddies, eating weeds and pests, aerating the soil with their burrows. When the rice is ready to harvest, they drain the paddies partially, harvest the rice, then flood them again and harvest the crawfish. 2 crops from the same land. Double the income. The economics made sense immediately. A farmer could make maybe 1,000 to 2,000 yuan per acre growing rice. With crawfish, they could make 5,000 to 10,000 yuan per acre, sometimes more. The decision was obvious. By 2015, entire counties had switched from pure rice farming to rice crawfish systems. The landscape changed. What used to be fields of rice became fields of rice with crawfish traps scattered throughout. And the crawfish kept getting bigger. Farmers started selective breeding, choosing the largest, fastest-growing crawfish to breed the next generation. Within a few years, farmed crawfish in China were noticeably bigger than wild ones. The industry was optimizing itself. Processing facilities popped up everywhere. Huge warehouses where crawfish were cleaned, sorted, packaged, and shipped. Some were sold live. Some were boiled and frozen. Some were processed into crawfish tails, ready to cook. The infrastructure grew to support billions of crawfish, moving from ponds to plates. Then came the restaurants. Crawfish restaurants were a phenomenon across China. Everywhere. Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, every major city had crawfish restaurant districts. Streets lined with nothing but crawfish joints, all competing for customers. The typical setup is outdoor seating, plastic tables and chairs, and crawfish served in huge metal bowls. Mala flavor, numbing Sichuan peppercorns and chili oil. But restaurants started getting creative. Garlic butter crawfish, cheese crawfish, crawfish with beer sauce, crawfish 13 flavors. Every variation you can imagine. Some restaurants serve nothing but crawfish, dozens of different preparations. And people couldn't get enough. May through September, when crawfish are most abundant, restaurants in major cities would go through hundreds of pounds per night. Lines out the door. People waiting an hour for a table just to eat crawfish. It became a social thing. Groups of friends meeting up, ordering 10 pounds of crawfish, drinking beer and spending the evening peeling and eating. The cultural impact was huge. Crawfish eating became a summer tradition. Companies started hosting crawfish parties for employees. Dating couples would go to crawfish restaurants. It became embedded in Chinese food culture in a way nobody predicted. This wasn't some niche food. This was mainstream. Everyone's doing it. National phenomenon level popularity. The logistics got insane. Crawfish prices would spike because demand outstripped supply even with billions of crawfish being farmed. Traders would buy up entire harvests from farmers, truck them to cities overnight, and sell them to restaurants the next morning. The crawfish supply chain became a legitimate industry unto itself. E-commerce got involved. Companies started selling live crawfish online, shipped overnight with ice packs. You could order 10 pounds of live crawfish from Hubei, and they'd show up at your door in Shanghai the next day. Crawfish became one of the top-selling fresh food items on platforms like Taobao during summer months. Then the government saw what was happening and doubled down. They started promoting crawfish farming even more aggressively. Subsidies for pond construction, technical support for farmers, marketing campaigns promoting crawfish consumption. The government realized they'd accidentally created a massive industry that was employing hundreds of thousands of people and generating billions in revenue. They weren't going to let that opportunity go to waste. Cities started branding themselves as crawfish capitals. Qianjiang City hosts an annual crawfish festival that draws hundreds of thousands of visitors. It's basically a multi-day celebration of eating crawfish, with competitions, concerts, and trade shows. Other cities followed suit. Crawfish became a point of regional pride. The industry kept growing. By 2018, China was producing over 1.5 million tons of crawfish annually. That's over 3 billion pounds. To put that in perspective, Louisiana, the crawfish capital of America, produces around 100 to 150 million pounds per year. China was producing 20 times more. The student had surpassed the master by an absurd margin. And it wasn't just domestic consumption. China started exporting crawfish. Frozen crawfish tails to America and Europe. Live crawfish to Southeast Asian markets. The Chinese crawfish industry became a global player. Ironically, some of the crawfish being sold in American grocery stores as wild-caught Louisiana crawfish were actually farmed in China and shipped across the Pacific. The circle was complete. But let's get back to the environmental side, because the story's not all economic success. The crawfish did cause problems. In some areas, their burrowing damaged irrigation systems. Farmers would find holes in their pond walls, water draining out, because crawfish had tunneled through. Crawfish also became a problem in some natural areas. Lakes that were supposed to be protected ecosystems found themselves overrun with crawfish eating everything in sight. Some native fish populations did decline, though it's hard to separate crawfish impact from pollution and overfishing. But the damage wasn't catastrophic. It was manageable. Most Chinese officials seemed to think the economic benefits far outweighed the ecological costs. There was also the issue of crawfish escaping into areas where they weren't wanted. Urban drainage systems sometimes got clogged with crawfish burrows. Parks and ornamental ponds found themselves invaded. Getting rid of them once they were established was basically impossible. Crawfish are survivors. They're not going anywhere. But here's the fascinating part. The environmental damage that everyone predicted. The total ecosystem collapse. It just didn't materialize on a large scale. Maybe Chinese ecosystems were more resilient than expected. Maybe the predation pressure was higher than predicted. Maybe the crawfish found an ecological niche that wasn't displacing native species as much as feared. Or maybe we just got lucky. Scientists are still studying it. What's undeniable is the economic transformation. Entire regions of China restructured their economies around crawfish. Villages that were struggling with poverty saw incomes rise dramatically when they switched to crawfish farming. Young people who had left for cities came back because crawfish farming was actually profitable. Rural areas that were dying got a new lease on life. The social impact was significant too. Crawfish farming doesn't require huge capital investment like some agriculture. A family with a small rice paddy could switch to rice crawfish farming without going into debt. It was accessible. This meant even poor farmers could participate in the boom. The wealth, relatively speaking, got distributed fairly widely. And the jobs created weren't just in farming. Processing facilities employed thousands. Restaurants employed thousands. Truck drivers, equipment manufacturers, everyone benefited. The ripple effects of the crawfish industry touched millions of people. By 2020, the crawfish industry was so established that COVID lockdowns caused a crisis. Restaurants shut down, demand collapsed, and suddenly farmers had millions of pounds of crawfish they couldn't sell. Prices crashed. Farmers were dumping crawfish back into rivers because keeping them alive in ponds cost more than they could sell them for. The government had to step in with subsidies to prevent a complete industry meltdown. But the industry recovered. When restrictions lifted, people went right back to eating crawfish. The demand roared back. By 2021, the industry was bigger than ever. The pandemic had been a temporary setback, not a permanent problem. Today, the Chinese crawfish industry continues to grow. Crawfish-flavored snacks, crawfish sauce, ready-to-eat crawfish meals. The innovation hasn't stopped, and farming techniques keep improving. Some farmers are experimenting with indoor systems, controlling temperature and water quality, to produce crawfish year-round instead of just seasonally. There's even crawfish tourism now. Farms offer tours where visitors can catch their own crawfish, cook them on site, and eat them fresh. It's become an agritourism attraction, especially popular with urban families wanting to show their kids where food comes from. The scientific community's view on the whole thing has evolved. Initial predictions of disaster were clearly wrong. The reality was more complex. Yes, crawfish are invasive. Yes, they've changed Chinese ecosystems. But they've also created enormous economic value and haven't caused the apocalyptic damage that was feared. Some scientists argue this proves that invasive species management needs to be more nuanced, considering economic and social factors alongside pure ecology. Others argue China just got really lucky, and that this shouldn't be used as a model for anything. Deliberately introducing invasive species is still a terrible idea in 99% of cases. The crawfish situation worked out, but that doesn't mean it was smart. It just means it didn't fail as badly as it could have. And honestly, both views have merit. The Chinese crawfish experiment was reckless from an environmental standpoint. It violated basically every principle of ecosystem management, but it also created a $60 billion industry and lifted hundreds of thousands of people out of poverty. Those are real benefits that can't be dismissed. The bigger question is whether this could be replicated elsewhere. Could other countries take an invasive species and turn it into an economic boom? But the specific conditions in China, the degraded waterways, the huge population, the cultural willingness to eat crawfish, the government's ability to coordinate large-scale farming efforts, all of that matters. It's not clear this would work anywhere else. What is clear is that the crawfish are in China to stay. They're not going anywhere. The population is stable. The industry is mature. The results are in. Against all odds, it worked. The crawfish invasion became a crawfish revolution. So yeah, China dumped millions of crawfish into their rivers. Everyone thought it was insane. And 10 years later, they've got a booming industry that nobody saw coming. Sometimes the craziest plans actually work out. If you found this interesting, hit subscribe. More stories about things that shouldn't have worked but did are coming soon.